Thank you everyone for joining us for the developer panel here at Cyber Days. My name is Anthony Humay. I'm a sophomore computer science student at the undergrad engineering school here. I guess just to start, could everyone just introduce themselves briefly and a little blurb about themselves?
Sure. Hi, I'm Steve Beauregard. I'm with Bloq. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer. We do enterprise solutions for large enterprises, usually financial institutions or supply chains. I got in the Bitcoin space, I just collectively call it the Bitcoin space, back in 2012 when I founded GoCoin, and large payment processor has processed about 100 million in payments. I also advise on a number of different companies, ICOs, and so forth. So active in pretty much every part of the ecosystem except for mining.
I'm Bhaskar Krishnamachari. I'm a professor of electrical engineering and computer science at USC. I am the director of our Center for CPS and IoT, and I'm teaching actually a graduate course in blockchain this semester. And in March, we're hosting actually a symposium on blockchain research.
My name is Jeff McDonald. I'm the vice president of the NIM Foundation, and NIM is an original code written 100% from scratch that started in 2014 and launched in 2015.
Hi everybody, my name is Miguel Morales, CTO at Kratos. I've been in the blockchain space about 2 years now. Heard about Bitcoin a long time ago, never interested me. I don't much care about currencies, but smart contracts were really interesting to me. Making systems that are uncensorable, unstoppable, really got me. So last year I participated in the AdChain ICO where I helped architect the product along with some consensus people. Super grateful, super cool to have worked there. We still have the fastest ICO, I believe, on record. Which is great. And yeah, now I'm working on a new project called Kratos, and we're basically trustless, scalable analytics, specifically for advertising.
Awesome. So thank you guys. So from a student's perspective, something that is really of interest to me and many of my classmates is just very generally, how do we get started to become, blockchain developers? So is there any general advice, like focusing on a specific platform, a certain tutorial set, just building something, getting your CS fundamentals down? Is there anything that you would recommend to an aspiring blockchain developer?
Yeah, I guess I'll go first because I'm more of came from a full stack engineering position, so I know mobile, backend, data science. When I started diving into blockchain was obviously just the easiest tool. So that's what I would recommend is the tools that are easiest to get started. So Solidity, Truffle, very easy to get started with because if you come from the JavaScript world, you just plug in. So if you're a JavaScript developer, if I would recommend is start learning JavaScript, just start building projects. There's simple projects that you can get started, like registries and other things. So you don't necessarily have to have a strong CS background to work on that, and that'll get you in the door. If you do have a strong CS background, even better, because then you can build more complex stuff, Merkle trees, Merkle proofs, hashes, all that good stuff.
I think I would kind of echo some of that. I think there's sort of 3 levels of being a developer. You could be developing just kind of front-end stuff. So if you have just JavaScript experience, web development, you could get started just at that level. There is working with tool chains like Solidity, where you can write smart contracts. If you have a decent background in object-oriented programming language, you can get started with that. It takes about 2 or 3 weeks to really hit the ground running for someone that's done some programming before. The third level, though, I think does require a stronger, I would say even graduate level engineering and computer science background. And that's if you want to actually develop new blockchain technologies and maybe kind of be at the cutting edge of the technology development.
Yeah, I've been advising with a company called Academy Token, and they have a fully accredited bunch of courses. So there's courses for somebody who's not a developer yet but wants to become a developer. There's full curriculum for somebody who is already a developer but wants to go through and take the courses. And then there's also like an executive track. So somebody who just wants to know from a business perspective what aspects they need to learn. But all of the coursework is online and available. So if you check it out at Academy Token, you can get a lot of good information there.
Awesome. So for someone kind of starting off looking for kind of a specific kind of protocol to build on, is there anyone, I guess this kind of segues into a separate question, kind of will the Ethereum protocol / Solidity become kind of the dominant smart contract language? And if not, what will, and what should you be investing your time in learning about right now?
So our take at the NIM Foundation is that Solidity is actually a little bit difficult to work with because you have to write your whole contract and it may or may not have bugs in it. So at NIM, what we've decided is to try to make it as easy as possible for developers to get into developing. And so we've made a lot of software development kits. And all our transactions work with JSON RESTful API. So to get developers into it, we have a lot of open source apps that people can fork and play around with. We give software development kits in JavaScript, TypeScript, PHP, Go, Python, C#. And so anybody basically with their software development kit can dive right in and get started.
Just very quickly, I mean, there are alternatives to Solidity. There's something called Viper that's in development. That's a Python-based alternative to Solidity as well. There are alternatives to Solidity as well for Ethereum. There's something called Viper, which is Python-based, that's under development, should be available at some point.
Yeah, at Bloq, we're working on something called Bloq Aura. It's out on GitHub. It's open source. And the idea is that you can use whatever programming language you're used to in any blockchain. So Solidity it's outstanding for Ethereum. It's a great, sort of 1.0 solution for smart contracts. But I truly believe that most big enterprises are going to be, building in the languages they're already familiar with, as opposed to taking on Solidity. So with Bloq Aura, you can then use whatever that is native to the organization and build your smart contracts with that.
Yeah, I would say that Ethereum and Solidity is the place to be right now. I particularly don't believe in any of the other platforms that have smart contracts right now. EOS, Tesos, they use things like delegated proof of stake, which to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So like the way that I see it is that Ethereum has that network effect. So if you think about like JavaScript, when JavaScript scripts started coming out, it wasn't the best language. There were still bugs, but it got the network effect. And I think that's what happened. Like, other developers the best developers, say, are on Ethereum. And yeah, I mean, when I see people talk about, oh, we can build different languages for a platform, well, you can do that also with Ethereum, right? It's still a language that you can compile to the virtual machine code. So you can do that also. Just contribute to Ethereum, I would say. Those are my thoughts.
Cool. So kind of staying on this topic of comparing the different protocols, do you see one that is best positioned for scalability? Probably Jeff, you would be interested in talking about proof of importance with NEM, but for the rest of you as well?
Sure. I don't believe any public blockchain is ever going to completely scale. Google, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, Apple, all of them want to get into the blockchain world. The moment that they do, they're going to take up any bandwidth of any public blockchain. It doesn't matter. No public blockchain. The reason why they're not in it right now is because public blockchains cannot meet their needs and their demands. And my house in South Korea has 16 lanes in front of it when I turn out to go to work. And as soon as you build a road, people are going to come. And so I think that the true answer for scalability is going to be off-chain solutions, Lightning Network, private networks. In NIM, for the last 27 months, we've been working on a hybrid model where we're the first ever blockchain that does a companion public chain and private chain. So you can put a certificate on like a certificate for an IoT device on the public chain, and that's a one-time stamp on the public chain, but every time that door is locked or unlocked or who went into that door, that's all put on a private chain, which is secured and anchored to the public chain. So that's kind of our solution, that no matter what, Bitcoin, when I got into Bitcoin, we did 0-fee transactions. And now it costs $25. No matter what your public chain is and how big it is, someone's going to fill it up.
I think there's sort of many dimensions of scalability. There's number of nodes. There's transactions per unit time, there's the transaction fee, there is the size of the transactions. So I think at the moment there isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. Depending on what your application needs are, you end up finding what makes sense. But as the technology develops, I think it's going to push on all of those fronts.
Yes, I was told recently that if you want to put a gigabyte of data on the Ethereum blockchain, it costs about $10 million. So you have to put in perspective that these aren't databases, and really what you want to do is optimize. So you might have a big data set, you're still going to have to store that somewhere, but if you just store the hash of it on the blockchain, that makes a lot more sense. Lightning Network is quite an interesting one, because they are doing those off-chain. So think of it like a bar tab. You go into the bar, you don't pay every time that you're getting a drink. At the end, you're going to clear your tab, and that one transaction is the one that goes down.
Cool. Personally, so I'm in kind of a full disclosure. I'm an Ethereum fanboy. So I'm just going to say that it's Ethereum because they're tackling it at different levels. First is proof of stake with Casper, which is going to scale proof of work. Then you have side chains with Plasma. So they're also tackling scalability on the sidechain level. Then you have sharding, which basically is a combination of all three. And I believe in the team, and I've looked at the white papers. I think they have a good approach. There's a lot of interesting platforms like I think IOTA, Ripple, but they don't have smart contracts, as far as I know. Then you have platforms like Hyperledger, which I think like the only reason, for example, that they can go to 100,000 events per second is because there's like 5 validator nodes. And they implement PBFT, Practical Byzantine Fault Tolerance, which means that they'll be limited to 100,000. That's it. So that's my approach. Those are my thoughts. I think Ethereum has the best approach because they're tackling it at different levels. And yeah, I'm not a big fan of other platforms.
I'll jump in there to be a counter voice to Miguel. When I started off in Bitcoin, everybody told me that Bitcoin was going to scale and that Bitcoin was going to be the best. And then the counterparty guys said counterparty is going to do all the tokens. And now nobody is sitting here arguing that Bitcoin is going to be the most scalable, right? To me, I believe that you either get it done right the first time or you don't get it right at all. And that when it comes to blockchain upgrading, if Vlad can pull off proof of stake and then they implement sharding, that is the most amazing update of any blockchain ever. And if they do that, you should go all in on Ethereum, right? Because that's proven that they have genius level intellect working on that project. For me personally, I think it's easier and better just to integrate those solutions into the platform at the very beginning, and to do that. And so that's kind of how I feel. I hope they do it because Ethereum is not a direct competitor for NIM, but I think it's just easier to start off from scratch rather than try to fix the problem as you go along.
Sorry, we just one last thought there. So you mentioned Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin also has a chance, right? I kind of agree about like having to build it in at the start, but I think they have a pretty good system. Like they've implemented SegWit and right? They're also implementing smart contracts on the Bitcoin blockchain, which are really interesting. And of course with Lightning, so if you combine those things, you could technically have a competitor for Lightning smart contracts on the Bitcoin blockchain. So that's really interesting if they pull it off also.
At the risk of disagreeing with the public blockchain only views here, I think permission blockchains will have a place. They will not be for every application you can think of, but there are business applications, particularly around supply chain, where it's really 8 companies that want to coordinate their activities with each other. They don't really want everybody on the planet in on the blockchain. Permission blockchains have a role to play. So things like Hyperledger Fabric and Ripple are going to play a role, I think.
No, I totally agree, especially in the enterprise, because you can't have all the transactions visible, especially in a supply chain when there's competitive situations. You don't want every one of those transactions visible, because once you figure out which wallet goes to which supplier, well, the other, other vendors is going to go after those deals. They'll see what the volume of business is, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a big place for permission blockchains in the corporate.
Cool. So obviously scalability has some interesting solutions. Is there any kind of, I guess, underrated problem that you see coming up from a developer standpoint with blockchain in general, something that doesn't get enough attention that should be addressed more often? maybe it's just something as simple as adoption or
It's network throughput. Everybody's talking about transactions per second, transactions per second. That's actually pretty easy to do. 2 years ago, we were doing tons of transactions per second. After you get transactions per second, you need to figure out how are you going to get all the nodes to support those transactions per second to make sure that your network is still decentralized and secure.
I'd say transaction fees are definitely an issue to be addressed more.
If I can speak to that, I mean, at GoCoin, we had our average transaction value is about $20. And so the cost of the mining fees now to do a $20 transaction is somewhere around $6. And so it's pretty infeasible. We, in the early days, I had some slides, I would talk to merchants and say, hey, this is much better than credit cards. Well, truth be told, until you get to about $500, it's not better than a credit card. And it's really sad that that's where we are. But things like Lightning Network and those have some promise to bring the transaction fees down.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just chime in. I mean, I completely agree. I think gas costs, network throughput are super important. Yeah, I mean, I completely agree.
Cool. So I kind of want to shift focus and talk more about the developer community and kind of the sub-communities within that. So do you have any, I've heard kind of some varying opinions on the maturity and kind of how the get-rich-quick mentality has kind of seeped into the developer landscape. Is that really a tangible, real thing? Or if it is, how has that affected your interactions with other developers? Or is it kind of based more in one protocol? Is Ethereum a little more developed, advanced? What is it kind of like within each community of developers?
Okay. Yeah, there's a lot of people that are going after the money, obviously, but there's even a second problem, which is for the people that weren't going after the money, like in Ethereum, there's a lot of great Ethereum developers, and now they're getting $5,000, $10,000, $20,000, $20,000, $30,000 a month to write good Solidity contracts. And then how do you keep on that talent, right? Somebody got into it for the love of blockchain and for the love of smart contracts, and now they're a millionaire. And they're like, I don't even have to ever work ever again. And now they're going off and partying, and we're losing these developers. We're losing good developers left and right sometimes, just because they're too rich now.
Yeah, completely agree. I think it's extremely challenging when you go out hiring people because as soon as you put Solidity, your price doubles. And so, one of our strategies has been to go after people that don't have any direct experience with Solidity, and then we train them. So yeah, and we definitely see that problem because just because you wrote a smart contract, maybe a token sale contract or something like that, doesn't quite mean that you warrant that kind of pay. So we try to look for talent that just doesn't quite have, they haven't given into that greed, and then after that they go through us. If they want to give into it, that's fine.
And Miguel, I'm kind of interested, this kind of loops back to my original question. How long does it take normally to train someone?
It definitely depends on their skill level, expertise, and level of interest. How hard are they willing to work? I think based on that, generally we see people contribute within 2 weeks, PRs, pull requests.
I'll actually second that. I'm teaching a graduate course on blockchain this semester. I think it took about 3 weeks for students that are MS and PhD students in computer science to be really up and running, writing very good Solidity code. It's not so much, Solidity is not the barrier. The barrier is do you sort of understand programming, and if you have that, I think it's not so deep.
Cool. So kind of more on the lack of developer talent. Do you see kind of talent concentrated in specific geographic areas, or is it kind of all around? Can you kind of describe where you're seeing the main concentration of the quality people at, or is it mostly a random distribution?
Sure, I think San Francisco, for sure, the Bay Area. We see a lot of talent there. New York, right? A lot of people that either come from Consensus, although Consensus is pretty international. Yeah, definitely the Bay Area, New York, Los Angeles. We personally hire a lot from Brazil. So, if you guys, want any tips, we work, literally half of our team are from Brazil. or living in, like, say, Germany, but from Brazil. So yeah, a lot of talent in Brazil.
Cool.
Yeah, we've had a lot of luck down in Argentina, so we got a lot of folks, and that's a place where they really need blockchain and they really need these technologies because of their failing currencies. But there's also a lot in Eastern Bloc countries. We're seeing a lot of developers that are very talented coming from like the Bulgarias, Romania, places like that. So.
How do those people get noticed if they're coming from a more obscure place? Is it just kind of word of mouth, or what would you recommend to someone perhaps in the audience who's a blockchain engineer and wants to get their name out there more? What hackathon maybe they should go to?
Yeah, hackathons are good, but also I think a lot of it's just contributing to the open source projects and building up your GitHub and presenting the work that you've done. So, but I'll let some of the others.
Okay. So I guess something very straightforward that I've been meaning to ask is, which protocol is your favorite and kind of why? So maybe quickly.
That's a tricky way to ask. You're really asking which coin should you invest in.
I'm not saying that, but you can interpret it like that.
My favorite is NIM.
Unsurprising.
Ethereum, Bitcoin. That's it.
My favorite is something that is in the minds of a young engineer at the moment, somewhere on the planet, we don't know yet, and it's still under development. So we'll hear about it.
So
I'm going to agree with that. I think that you've yet to see the one that's going to, I don't even know that there's going to be one winner. I think there's going to be many, but the ones that really take off, I think it's still in development. I agree.
So I would second that. And at NIM, we've been rewriting our new major update from scratch, 100% original code again. This is our third time. And it's codenamed Catapult. And the first version of NIM that we have right now took 14 months, and this version's taken 27 months. And I would say that it definitely is my biggest fear, that somebody else has been writing a blockchain for the last 2 or 3 years from scratch that works really, really well. And I think there was a Weiss report that came out, and they didn't give any blockchain an A. They gave everybody like a B, B minus, C plus, D, and that's the reality on the ground, that everybody's blockchain is far from perfect right now. And so I think in 2019, there's going to be people sitting on stage that are talking about a new blockchain that we're not today, and it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, I was at the Miami conference when they announced Ethereum, and a lot of the developers that were working on the project were doing it completely voluntarily, but they were going to get some tokens in the initial token launch. And so a lot of those guys, like we talked about before, are filthy rich now. I'm talking like 50 million, north of 50 million rich. And so that whole pool of people, pretty much, like you said, they're out partying and having fun. But I think there's going to be projects like that come out where people will now work for on the come, saying that, hey, I'm going to take some of the tokens from this, and I'm going to volunteer my time, just betting that this is going to be the next big thing. And we're seeing that quite often. So a lot of the developer pool is really sort of on these ICO projects and building innovations.
I'm going to disagree with Miguel again, and the good doctor. I don't think it's going to be Ethereum. And I'll explain why. Because Ethereum is Turing complete. And as much as everybody thinks that it's really easy to write in a Solidity, and I think it is, basically to begin to write in Solidity, it turns out to be very difficult to write a contract that's perfect. And Dr. Gavin Wood is the main author of Solidity, and he has had his smart contract break multiple times. He couldn't even write a simple multi-sig contract, and everybody was using his multi-sig contract, and it's broken not once, but twice. And he's the author of Solidity, right? So I think that it's easy to write a simple contract in Solidity, but the problem with Turing complete contracts is what happens on the blockchain stays on the blockchain. You don't get to take it off. And that means that your contract needs to be not only better than everybody today, but you need to be better than everybody tomorrow and the next year and the next year. There could be some 15-year-old kid right now in Russia whose Solidity is his first language. He speaks Solidity better than Russian, right? He eats Solidity for breakfast every day. And in 2021, if that kid is better than your developer today, he's going to own your contract because you can't go back and undo it and update it. And that's the big problem with Turing-complete contracts. Now, that being said, I think that as Ethereum gets battle tested and some of these basic contracts like Dr. Wood's parity contract breaks a second time and a third time and a fourth time, eventually it becomes a very good contract and we can rely on it. But it has to be battle tested and it has to be proven over time.
I just kind of want to follow up on the train of thought about, and that's a good point, about what doesn't exist yet. So I guess if I were to say what would be my favorite protocol if it did exist, it would be a combination of Ethereum, Hyperledger, and Monero, where you have smart contracts. They're fast, so you have a high throughput, but they're also private. So I think that would be, like, if y'all want to tackle that.
We can't do that.
All right, so kind of moving on to just more general opinions on kind of, it was mentioned earlier, there's a little bit of disdain, I guess, for some certain types of permissioned blockchains. Could you talk more about your opinions on permissionless, public permission, and private permission chains? Obviously, they each have their pros and cons for varying applications, but in general, which one is kind of most stands out to you as, I guess,
I mean, I think these gentlemen had it right. I mean, I think it depends on your use case. Right? The projects that I've been involved with, private chains don't make a whole lot of sense, but I'm getting into into the enterprise world, and advertisers don't want their data to be shared. And that's why I mentioned Monero, because we're working on something where it's public but still private. That's why you have like zero knowledge proofs and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of applications for private chains. If it makes sense for your project and your business, go for it. I just think a lot of them are marketing gimmicks. So things like, oh, why do we offer high throughput? Any system can be private, and that's not really in the spirit of the blockchain, I would say, also. And yeah, I think a lot of it are like just marketing gimmicks, like saying, oh, we have this high throughput, we implement these consensus, pluggable consensus, based on algorithms that have existed for years, but there's a reason people don't use them, So yeah, I think, and also like tokenization, how are you, it's more challenging, and not just technically, but legally. How do you have a token that's used in a private chain be tradable in a public exchange? There are projects like OmniLayer, but then you get into some murky legal waters there. So that's my thought. I think they're powerful, but I have my opinions about it, but I think if your project, if you need it and it makes sense for you, go for it, absolutely.
Yeah, I think interoperability between public chains and private chains are the future. And one of the things that's also interesting is inside the enterprise, one of the solutions that we're seeing is using Monero or a Zcash inside of the enterprise because of or within consortiums or small groups of companies that are working together, because that way you can still obscure the transactions so that the competitors can't look at the transactions and do some data mining and figure out what exactly is going on. So I think there's going to be some room for that.
I think just as an academic, what's fascinating to me is if you look at the entire distributed systems literature on consensus, there was sort of never a work that broke certain assumptions. And the assumption in virtually all of that literature had been that every participant in the consensus algorithm is known. So you don't have to worry about what's called the Sybil attack, somebody pretending to be other identities. And so in some sense, there's this big literature one can rely on to develop Byzantine fault-tolerant consensus algorithms, but they've always had this assumption baked into them. And a different way of looking at the Bitcoin protocol that Satoshi developed is that it's really the first consensus algorithm that's developed that doesn't have this assumption baked into it. But I think there's, so as you look at permission blockchain technologies today, they offer something for corporate environments where there aren't a large number of participants, but you do know the identities of everybody that's on the chain, and that gives you, the benefit of the high transaction volumes and so on. But at the same time, I think simply just as a question of how long we've spent in blockchains, there hasn't been enough time to think through what other protocols exist. So I wouldn't rule out the possibility that between now and the next few years, we get permission blockchains that can support much larger numbers of users, as well as some levels so basically, somewhere between being completely anonymous and being completely permissioned, there may be other hybrids in between. And there are definitely going to be use cases that span the spectrum, but I think the solutions are still being developed.
I'll jump in real quick. The public blockchain always gives you the best security. No private blockchain is ever going to give that to you. And the public blockchain always gives you the highest level of trust. No private blockchain is ever going to give you that level of trust, right? And the public blockchain is always going to be able to reach and dive into more markets and reach more people into the world. And a private blockchain, because it's private, is not ever going to be able to do those things, right? Now, at the same time, the public blockchain is incredibly expensive. Expensive to maintain because that security, that trust, that reaching into all these markets cost a lot of money. The private blockchain ends up, in comparison, being extremely cheap, but you're sacrificing that trust. You're sacrificing that security. You're sacrificing that ability to reach all over the world into different markets. So the challenge becomes, how are we going to balance the security and the trust with the price and the throughput, right? And so that's the big challenge that people should be looking at right now. How are we going to make these two models compatible, work together, make a companion chain that gives you the best of both worlds, right? But also gives you all the benefits. So and without a lot of the costs and the vulnerabilities. And that's the real challenge in between these two models. And sometimes the company is going to want one, sometimes the company is going to want the other, and some people are going to look at both.
Awesome. All right, so for my last question before I open it up to the audience, I was just wondering, from a developer perspective, what are your thoughts on decentralized autonomous organizations, and how hard are they really to make and do well, and kind of what's the future of the DAO?
Yeah, it's very, very fascinating. The whole concept, really is new, and because of this invention, you're starting to see this whole concept of the distributed autonomous organizations. And so a lot of the tokens are foundations. Like you guys are set up as a foundation, and most of them, that's what they're doing. They're forming these foundations in lots of times Switzerland or Singapore, or a couple of other jurisdictions that have come about. But I think that there's a great future. I think the thing that we have to realize is today, the way corporations are set up with their customers, the incentives are completely out of line. The incentives of what the shareholder is looking for, what the corporation is looking for, and what the customer is looking for are not aligned. An example is, Apple wants to charge a price for you to plug your phone in. You have to buy their adapter, et cetera, et cetera. Well, we don't, as a consumer, that's terrible for us. I should be able to plug it into something universal and just be able to buy a very affordable piece. So I think what DAOs give you is the ability for the first time to align incentives between the people holding the tokens and using them in the ecosystems. So.
DAOs are very, very interesting. I think it works for some cases. I'm not particularly sure that you can codify human behavior to that level. For example, you don't see the Ethereum, when the fork happens, going through a smart contract to activate the fork. We have protocols like, I think, EOS or Tesos that have on-chain governance. And well, there's a big argument. I'm more for, like, I think you can't fully automate that. And that has to do more with human behavior and incentives, and honestly a level of control where, and it's kind of hard to say because there's, blockchains are decentralized, but sometimes developers, and this is what happened in the DAO fork, have to have that say, unfortunately, like where the project is going, kind of like what are the core what are the core philosophies of that project and enforce them. And I'm not sure that you can codify that into a smart contract.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think that everything's completely complicated right now with DAOs and how they're being done. In the NIM, we have like a $300 million fund that we give to developers that are trying to make projects, and we do community funding. And in theory, that's a good DAO, except for that at the end of the day, it takes a centralized group of people to sign the contract, right, after they look at the blockchain vote. And I think that no matter what, I haven't seen a very good DAO example that's worked very well to meet my satisfaction. And it's going to be a long way. That's an incredibly complicated thing to do. Sending a coin, easy. Making a DAO, way harder.
All right, so I'd like to open it up to audience questions now. Just a reminder, please don't make it a comment, and please skip the introduction. Just a quick question is what we're looking for. You?
We need a lot more of that. It's Wild West. People are rolling their own cryptos and blockchains and just throwing them out there, and money's getting stolen. Right? The more testing, the more experimenting, the more research. There's hardly any academic research. And right now, if you're an academic, right now, it's a great time to get into blockchain, studying, writing papers, doing research, publishing, independently auditing people.
I have to agree with that. Certainly, just as an example, all of the work in the Internet of Things could benefit from connecting with blockchains when it comes to actually building economic models around sensor data, around actuation. So I think the challenge is that in academia, particularly fields that weren't, let's say, at the core of Bitcoin and blockchains, there's been a relatively slow propagation of the ideas. So somebody that works on networks, that works on software engineering and AI and IoT doesn't necessarily today have quite a full understanding of the blockchain technologies and how it might impact them. But I think that's happening. Certainly this year and the next, you'd start to see more of those sort of side subjects connecting.
I think once the sort of ICO craze starts to slow down, which it's already starting to some degree, because a lot of energy is going into that, and a lot of the best minds are still trying to do their new coin and innovate with the coin. But as it gets so noisy that there aren't very many successful ICOs, I think that's when you're going to start seeing all sorts of innovations around. Internet of Things is a great example. I mean, I Airbnb one of my houses, and I would love to be able to have something that metered, how much energy they're using, because some people just, leave the doors wide open, run the air conditioning. So I'd love to be able to have a token and say, look, you have this many credits, and then have the, the thermostat check that. If they want to buy more credits, they can buy more credits and leave the doors open and run the air conditioning. So there's a lot of cool stuff that will come. But I think it's still 2 to 5 years out.
If you're really interested, I'd suggest looking at Cardano. They have really focused on the academic research into building their blockchain. It's a good place to start.
Cool.
Yeah,
So
just one last thought. I mean, from my point of view, I would like to see more like SaaS offerings where I can just kind of deploy some different types of nodes, different proof of stake nodes that I can deploy through one interface, and that would be great. I don't think that exists, and Fiora is taking a stab at it, but I would definitely love like a multi-chain SaaS product. I think game theory is the key to build the next generation of products, right? Like if you can't figure out like if I put up a node or if I participate in this, what's the ROI, for example? Like if I put up a node, am I wasting more money on electricity and on network costs than I would be making, if participating? So getting that right, those economies right, that game theory right, I think it's critical, and it's going to be really, really interesting with all the cool ideas that people are going to come up with.
all right, we could take another question.
I would say so. I mean, like, they're still number one. And, you know, you still have, like, Litecoin, for example, was a fork early on. And they implemented Lightning way before Bitcoin did, and they never overtook them. So I think it would have to be something really special to overtake them. But I think they're pretty, you know, they're 1 and 2 for a reason. And yeah, I think it's going to be hard.
I disagree. I think if you look at the data, you can see that Bitcoin is constantly losing share to other markets, and Ethereum's eventually going to flip Bitcoin, and we call that the flippening, right? But if you look at the exponential growth of the newer chains, they always grow faster, and they always grow at greater speed. So Bitcoin's going like this, Ethereum's going like this, some of the newer chains, maybe like EOS or NEO, they're going like that, and I think we're going to see that continuing trend, and that the market's going to just expand. And I think that there's a lot of data that shows market cap, YouTube videos, articles being rented, press reports that shows that there's an ever increasing exponential growth of new projects.
Yeah, it's going to be a multi-chain, multi-token, multi-network world. So when you say, is that one going to overtake it? You know, Bitcoin's a great store of value. It's a crappy transactional currency. Ethereum is a little bit better today, but when it gets congested, you know, it's going to have the same problems. It's going to have the same problems, and that's going to leave the room open for others. So Bitcoin has lost a lot of dominance, but I kind of say, so what?
Actually, there's another interesting perspective on this, which is, you know, one of the things that locks in and gives an advantage to one chain over another is if they have a specialized programming environment. So you've got so much invested in terms of code onto that platform, it's hard to port. But there are efforts, for example, Blockstack, which are trying to create an abstraction layer on top of the blockchain technology. So you write code that could potentially run on any blockchain, and all you have to do is sort of build these connectors to the different blockchain technologies below. So if things like that take off, I think it would potentially lower that barrier to entry.
All right, yep.
Yeah, that was called Academy Token, and they have full curriculum for developers of any level, and then curriculum also for people that just, like executives that want to understand how they can implement it or what it means to their company.
There's also lots of Hello World examples out there on Truffle, on Hyperledger Fabric, whatever your platform of choice is.
All right, could probably take one more, yep.
All the blockchains suck right now. Basically, I mean, we've talked to multiple central banks around the world. All the major companies are looking into it, and the UN is definitely looking into blockchain too. There's just no blockchain that's going to be able to service the bank right now. And when there is, they'll do it.
All right, we could probably take one more quick question. There is one. Or if, oh, yeah.
Perhaps a stupid question from a developer point of view. Could Bitcoin, could blockchain be used to combat fake news? To verify the sources?
Yeah, this goes back to that whole incentive problem. Like fake news is a problem because the incentives are out of alignment. You know, people put up inflammatory headlines and a bunch of garbage behind it because they want to get clicks so that they can get the revenue from those pages. But yeah, you absolutely could use a blockchain in that instance and reward the people who are putting the best quality stuff out. And that is an interesting use.
I mean, there are solutions like Steemit is an example of something that's like a Reddit equivalent, but with blockchains.
I mean, I think it'll solve the problem as it'll stop censorship, right? So when you say fake news, that means that you have an opinion on that content, right? What What's that? Everyone should have a say, right? So that's the way that I think about it, is that the blockchain and decentralization enable the free speech, right? And that's something that I really believe in. And it's one of the things that got me into the blockchain, in that you cannot censor people based on your political opinions, right? And I think this is one of the problems that you see on like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. And so I do believe that blockchain can fix this, as in it can make systems that are uncensorable.
All right, so it looks like we're just about out of time. If everyone could just give a warm round of applause for my panel. Thank you. Oh, and